All right. Welcome again to everybody that's still joining and to those joining just now. We're going to go ahead and get started in the interest of time. So welcome again, everybody, to the Value Beyond Value Chains workshop. This workshop/webinar is part of the Food and Agricultural Commodity Systems community, formerly known as the Green Commodities community. We are rebranded as of this month. And I see still people joining. So as folks have been mentioning, if you could introduce yourself in the chat, and if you're able to also note your organization on your name in the Zoom. My name is Matthew McFall. I'm part of the Food and Agricultural Commodities Systems team here at UNDP, and I'm a senior private sector advisor. So I'll let my colleagues introduce themselves as they start. Charlie, are we ready for the slides?
Yeah, are you seeing the slides?
I see the opening, yes.
Yeah. You want to kick off?
Yep. Okay. So today we're first going to start the agenda. We're doing welcome introductions. We'll have an overview of the key ideas around value beyond value chains, what the concept is, who is designed for, and why companies should be engaging beyond their value chains. So that'll last about 15 minutes or so, and then we're going to go into breakout rooms in smaller groups where we can have a more detailed discussion around where do you see the greatest potential for increasing private sector collaboration with governments, and what do you see as the greatest barriers? How do you think this material could be most useful in your work, most helpful? And how do you imagine using it in your own organization and with your partners? And also, what else is missing? What is needed? And what support would be helpful from our side? So this is a learning session, a workshop, so we want to get everyone's feedback as much as possible. And then after the breakout rooms, we will have time for a plenary where we'll hear a bit from some of our colleagues from the private sector on their experiences engaging beyond their value chains. And we'll have some takeaways and learnings from the breakout rooms, and then followed by a brief conclusion at the end.
Yeah, thanks, Matthew.
Take it away, Charlie.
So yeah, this is a project we've been working on for 2 or 3 years at UNDP, and really the objective of it is all about strengthening private sector collaboration with governments, particularly through landscape and national and subnational jurisdictional work. So the sort of the lens through which to read this material or to consider it is that the main aim of it was really is to influence decision makers in what we call the movable middle. So the leading companies, who have been engaging in jurisdictional and landscape work for a while, are very familiar with the arguments for it. They're very familiar with what's needed, how to go about it. But it's a pretty small group of companies, and if we're really going to increase the engagement of companies with governments at landscape and jurisdictional level, we're going to have to explain the rationale for companies of why they should do that. The name of this project, Value Beyond Value Chains, was obviously a bit sort of deliberately provocative, because after all, what value could there be beyond the value chain? The whole notion of a value chain is that it includes all the value. But what we argue is that historically, the approach to value chains has been too narrowly defined in terms of managing supply chain, partners, risks, opportunities, etc. And unless you look at the wider enabling environment, then you don't really address the systemic risks and nor do you really address the kind of both the needs and opportunities of what we need to be doing collectively at the national and subnational levels. But it is also a tool that hopefully can be useful for those who are in leading companies. So people sitting in sustainability functions and other functions that may be familiar with this, hopefully this material can be useful for them to share with colleagues. And the way this piece of work has been produced is as a shareable PowerPoint. Although it's quite long, the whole idea of it is to encourage people to basically take slides out, cut and paste it, adapt it, use it for your own purposes. So it's a kind of mega deck from which you can pick things that are helpful, images that are useful, key ideas that are useful, and integrate it into your own presentations and your own work. And then finally, we hope that this can be picked up by other multilateral agencies and civil society organizations for work engaging with companies or engaging with, company associations and groups. So the focus, as I mentioned, is focusing on why greater public-private collaboration is necessary for agricultural commodity sustainability, beyond just managing supply chain issues, and how companies can go about it. We don't get into the real depth of the detail on that, and other organizations have already produced very good guidance on this, whether that's ProForest, WWF, TFA, the CGF Forest Positive Alliance, etc. And the TFA's Jurisdictional Resources Hub is a good place to go for some of those or many of those resources. So just over the next sort of 10 minutes, we're just going to share some sort of the high level storyline, if you want, from this slide deck, which hopefully you've all got access to, and hopefully many of you have already downloaded. This is just the sort of super summary version. You'll see in the deck, we start with attending to some of the systemic risks. What's the rationale for this? And basically the rationale being that if companies only focus on supply chain risks, we're still not solving the problem. So historically, there's been a big focus on creation of global standards, global frameworks, and then pushing them down through supply chains all the way down to farmer level. But the enabling environment has not been addressed to the level which it needs to be addressed. So you've got these kind of global initiatives, supply chain initiatives, but there's a sort of gap in the middle at the landscape, subnational, national level. So that's really what we're attending to here. The result of that approach has been a sort of a two-tier production system where you've got islands of best practice. So sort of leading companies driving good practice through their own supply chains down to their own farms. In some cases, 100% certified supply, etc. But it hasn't raised the floor for the whole of the sector because there are many companies that aren't doing it, and there are many markets that are happy to buy products based purely on price and not on environmental and social criteria. So really, the challenge now is very much about raising the floor. Yes, a leading practice as advanced by some of those leading companies is great, but we really need to raise legal minimums, both in terms of the regulatory environment, but also its enforcement and everything that goes with that, including capacity building, investment, etc. So that's really what we're attending to here. So why should companies think about engaging with governments? Increasingly, we're seeing, historically, of course, companies were perceived to often have a negative influence on government regulation and tended to want to weaken it rather than strengthen it. Now, I think many companies understand that a stronger regulatory environment is very much in everybody's favor, for the reasons I've just explained. So how might they be thinking about engaging with governments? Well, so at the national level, how do you create a positive enabling legal and economic framework in terms of land tenure, land use planning laws, environmental and labor laws, production standards, national land use monitoring systems, etc., etc. a critical thing is, how do you align agendas across ministries? You know, sometimes you might have the Ministry of Environment is quite on board with some of these issues, but the Ministry of Agriculture might be pointing in a different direction, or the Ministry of Health or Transportation or Finance may be working at odds with each other. So one of the critical things we need to encourage is better collaboration across ministries, improved alignment. And I think the private sector has a very strong potential role to play in really giving the political will to governments to take a more ambitious and progressive approach to creating policy and regulatory environments. And then that goes through to how ministerial budgets are allocated, which obviously if governments are advancing this agenda, then that's in the interest of companies who don't have to carry the can all on their own. And aligning with nationally determined contributions, the whole climate agenda, as well as accessing international donor funding to support some of these initiatives. So that's a few of the reasons why companies could think about the rationale for engaging at national level. And at subnational level, then it's cascading down to regional development plans, local land use planning, again, aligning agendas across different departments within local, regional, local government. And at the landscape level, taking a cross-commodity perspective, integrating into wider issues of community development, social development, etc. Christina, if you want to pick it up from here.
Thank you, Charlie. So we've been talking about companies engaging and the sort of wider private sector, but what do we mean by that? So next slide, please, Charlie. I think we're all aware, and either because of who we are, so that the companies that are with us here today, or colleagues and partners who are working with the private sector, that obviously we have many different roles. So the different type of private sector organization will have a different entry point, different interests, and different reasons for engaging beyond the value chain, depending on their sphere of influence, their their objectives, and so on. So there's many different reasons, and we sort of tried to break it down a bit to help us identify that and tailor our strategies accordingly. So of course, we'd be sort of recommending that all companies, and with that, we're also including financial institutions, where possible, are identifying and participating in some of the forums that we know are currently existing or are being created at a landscape level, subnational level, or even national level. So where are they, and how can we or our supply chain partners participate in those? Where they exist, also try and support them and make sure that your suppliers and the producers that you're working with are aware of them and are participating as much as possible. Have we managed to align some of our corporate objectives with some of the plans that we know these platform and collective actions have developed? So how is what we're doing and the investments that we're making aligning with all of that? And how are we understanding and trying to work with some of those, again, collectively identified and agreed indicators where, again, when some of those action plans have been developed. And it's always really helpful to be able to, publish and share lessons that we've had from the work in our supply chains in order to bring about that leveling up that Charlie mentioned earlier. So how can we be promoting the learning by sharing some of the information that we have and some of the lessons that we'd have. Next, if we could advance a bit. But of course, the spectrum of the private sector is quite large, and depending, as I said earlier, kind of on where you are in the value chain, will also determine in part your reasons for and ability to engage with these different initiatives, and also at the different levels that Charlie was just explaining, from the landscape up to national, regional, and global, and so on. So, producer groups and primary processors, they are at the coalface. So how do we ensure, and how are they participating and being represented in a meaningful way in some of these initiatives? How are we able to share with them, or them share with us, by us, the collective effort that's happening on data that's going to help them ensure that they have visibility on, for example, satellite monitoring of land use change? How do they engage with that and use that for the work that they're doing? And how can they also be, and how do we support them to collaborate in an equal way with the companies and with governments where these opportunities exist? Next, please. And of course, moving up, traders are really a key part of all of this. Traders are, in the middle of most of these value chains and are the ones who are at the field level, engaging on a daily level with the producers, with processors. Very often they have the relationships also in some cases with the input providers. So they can also be playing a role in facilitating that. Producers are participating in their multi-stakeholder forum. They can also be ensuring that their national staff are also and subnational staff are aware of these opportunities for engagement. They can also be bringing in the perspective of the market for the national stakeholders if they're involved in international supply chains, as well as the other way around, helping the producer groups that they're engaging with and buying with understand the market requirements in terms of social, environmental, etc. Traders can also play a role in how they do business. So are they providing long-term contracts? Are they also providing incentives to producers for some of these practices that we said? Now, are they sharing that then with the wider group? Thank you, Charlie. Next. And many manufacturers and brands, of course, interested in that, they may be reliant on their trader and other supply chain partners at the origin where they are sourcing their raw materials from. But in a way, they can also, they also can have a role in how to engage beyond the value chains and encouraging this wider and more effective collaboration. So how do you work with your suppliers to be helping them identify where they need to be engaging and how do you help bring in your perspective as a brand into those through those supply chain partners that you're working with? You can also work with your suppliers and help prioritize critical sourcing regions, again, together, trying to find where can we make a difference more together. Most crucially, this is where we start moving into the customer facing bit. So how do you start raising awareness with your customers around the enabling condition and what does sustainable production mean and what is the role of these forums, but also as consumers, what is your role in this? Next, please. And then ultimately the customer facing retailers. We know many European retailers are themselves very much engaged in some of the commodity multi-stakeholder forums, but increasingly as we work with retailers and retail companies in within kind of national context, how are we encouraging them to also participate in some of these multi-stakeholder forums? How do we show why this collaboration would also be of value to them and why their voice and their participation will be really important? What are the incentives that they have to participate in that, and how do we make that known to them? And again, of course, critical for bringing in that awareness of consumers in the country where those retailers are present. And last but by no means least, of course, is the finance sector. And we know we're increasingly aware financial institutions are playing a huge role in this. So how do we engage with them more effectively? They are already beginning to step up and be engaged in many of the commodity or national fora that UNDP is involved with, but they provide crucial technical expertise. They can also encourage participation of other financial institutions and are providing themselves an incentive for engaging in these. So just a little summary there. There's a lot more information behind this, as Charlie said, available in the resources that we had, but really good to help break down, depending on where you are in the value chain, what kind of an organization you are or you are working with. There'll be different reasons and benefits for you to be joining this improved and enhanced collaboration. Over to you, Charlie. Oh, sorry, over to Matthew. Sorry, over to Matthew.
Thanks, Christina. So just as different types of companies can think about these issues, so can different departments within a company. So, what does engaging beyond value chains mean for different elements of an organization or business? So all departments have, a role to play in supporting engagement in multi-stakeholder initiatives. Some actions are cross-departmental, some are played within departments, but there's establishing support and buy-in within your own teams is vital to fostering thinking on these areas, and embedding some of these aspects into strategic priorities and ensuring they're integrated into plans, and obviously sharing data and insights throughout the whole process is important. Oftentimes, certainly until perhaps more recently, the sustainability departments in many companies have been kind of the driver of sustainability more broadly, as typically a separate department. So that still remains a key business unit to drive areas in engaging beyond value chains, whether it's looking at environmental and social risks, pre-competitive collaborations, developing corporate strategies, and monitoring and reporting is one key element. Obviously, these departments tend to do most of the reporting to the various sustainability reporting programs and frameworks. I would note here one thing that perhaps is relevant, that there's been a lot of developments in the reporting space, notably around the accountability framework and CDP, particularly in supporting the landscape jurisdictional approach more and more to engaging in sustainable sourcing. And so I would just point that out as quite well aligned with the VBV approach, the way those systems are moving. And I would also put government affairs departments perhaps in this category of the types of things that are listed here under sustainability teams. I know different departments are labeled differently, and they tend to also have quite a role to play, particularly when we're talking about engaging with governments. And then on the marketing and communication side, there's a role to play for these teams, both internally and externally, communicating the importance of PPPs to your fellow colleagues, to leadership, and then obviously raising awareness externally. I think one key I would point out here that I think is important to keep in mind is the need to move beyond the ideas of a silver bullet solution. I think that's still quite prominent in this space, and there is no silver bullet to solving these problems, and so that's an important thing to maintain as an idea throughout an organization. And storytelling, I don't want to forget that. I think storytelling of successes and just telling the external folks and leadership just stories about what's been going on the ground. Certainly, perhaps the most important department in an organization to lead on these issues is the C-suite around the leadership in a company. They drive decision making, and so that's vital to give a mandate to other departments to play their role. We also have, when it comes to looking at food and agricultural companies, the agronomy and farmer support teams have an important role to play. They provide the technical expertise on the ground, and they can help the organization deepen their understanding of the context in terms of barriers that farmers are facing, the impacts of procurement practices and other issues going on the ground. They contribute expert knowledge and can share data on farm mapping, traceability. And then I would also, last but not least, the procurement teams. I believe that in my view, the success or the proliferation of sustainable sourcing commitments across many corporates is owed to moving sustainability elements out of the sustainability department, putting them into procurement, where you can look at your purchasing criteria, preferential sourcing, and developing KPIs around sourcing itself and the supply chain teams, so that that's embedded throughout that part of the business, which is very crucial to reaching the impacts on the ground. So back to Charlie.
Thanks, Matthew. Before we go into breakouts, just going to share quickly this framework we developed for thinking through the sort of matrix of activities that a company may want to consider. So down the left-hand side, we have different forms of action. Going from the bottom, you've got individual company action, company and supply chain action, which may be uncoordinated. Then you have in the middle tier sort of more coordinated action, and then up at the top actions that are more collaborative. And then if you go across the top of this matrix, you've got farms on the left and global on the right, with landscape, subnational, national in the middle columns. And if you were to plot out a company's activities across these different areas, you would tend to see sort of clusters of activities. And obviously down in the sort of the bottom left-hand side of this, bottom left-hand corner of this matrix, you've got commitments right at the bottom, you've got supply chain purchasing policies, you've got contracts and offtake agreements. So these are the kind of things that companies are pushing through their own individual supply chains. As you go further up, you begin to get into the space of advocacy, providing funding and technical assistance, which is having potentially a slightly more wider systemic effect. But it's only really when you get to the top in terms of collaborations across industries, building partnerships and coalitions, and really thinking about institution building, that you're really in the domain more of systemic change. But if it's just at the farm level, or just at the global level with global standards, global commitments, then we're not addressing the whole middle territory. So this is the sort of encouragement to companies to think about how to navigate up this from individual uncoordinated actions to more coordinated and collaborative actions, and also to sort of move into the middle, so working more collectively across entire sourcing landscapes and regions. This matrix could be filled out for any particular sourcing crop. So you could do it for your activities in rice or palm oil. You could do it for an issue, so you could do it for kind of smallholder support, or you could do it for human rights issues, labor issues, etc. In the slide deck, the downloadable version of it, we sort of pre-populated just an example of what this might look like, looking through the lens of farmer support. So if you were looking at farmer support across this matrix, what different types of activity might you be doing? So down in the bottom left-hand corner, you might be including social and environmental criteria in purchasing contracts through your supply chain, but up at the top, in the middle, you'd be looking much more at strengthening farmer organizations, farmer support services across entire jurisdictions, and how to institutionalize that, or how to support existing institutions doing that work. So this is just a framework to encourage companies to think more systemically beyond individual actions, and really how to think collectively as a sector, both with peers, with supply chain partners, but also with other external partners, governments and civil society organizations.
You with us, so thank you for participating in the breakouts and coming back into the plenary session. We were just, as always happens with these events, we were just getting into some great discussions when unfortunately we were cut short, and I know not everybody in the group that I was in had a chance to speak. So we'd like to now just give you a couple of minutes to put in the chat your thoughts, your key takeaways, either what you sort of mentioned in the breakout group, or anything else that's come to mind on the questions that we've posed to you, or just some general feedback. So we'll just give you a couple of minutes now to start noting those in the chat. Thank you. And feel free to put things in Spanish as well. Si sería mejor para usted escribirlo en español, con mucho gusto. Muchas gracias. O en French. And as we have some thoughts coming in, also do take a moment to read what colleagues have put in the chat. So please continue to put your thoughts in the chat there. I just wanted to invite somebody from my group, actually, Roger from IKEA. You gave some good, very concrete recommendations for how these could be improved, together with Christine from the Gates Foundation. Very good exchange there around. We need to make sure that the materials that we have are definitely applicable for business and have a crystal clear business case. But Roger, would you like to maybe share your thoughts with the group, and then we can leave the mic open for others to share their thoughts as well. Roger, are you still with us?
Yep. Yep, just checking. Yeah, I agreed with Christine, basically on the fact there needs to be a solid business case for the use of tools. Otherwise, generally actions will become more CSO developmental. So that's one thing that needs to be looked at with any use of initiatives. And also tools need to be very simplistic to be generally understood across a wide range of stakeholders. Otherwise, it'll be really only a few experts that can use them, and how much the buy-in from the company occurs because of that is often difficult. If a lot of people can't understand and use them, because in IKEA, we want a lot of people to understand what we're doing and why. And so it needs to be fairly simplistic and taken across a number of stakeholders.
And I think in the past, Roger, we've spoken, IKEA's had some, very sort of interesting and progressive views around this need to engage beyond value chains. So the need to be able to affect sort of wider change through this kind of collaboration. Would you like to maybe say a couple of words about that? Why is that important for you?
Well, generally, there's a lot of advocacy work going on in the world now. So we need to not just go beyond value chains, but into the legislative environment. So, there's a lot of expertise out there, and we need to broaden the horizons and pull in as much information as we can to make a good decision as we can in the future. So that's why it's not just about supply chains and value chains now, it's the broader international community that we need to take account of. So we generally need a lot of assistance, and definitely policy information and advocacy on that is really important to the private sector at the moment. It has been in the past, but very much so now.
Thank you for sharing those thoughts, Roger. I'm just going to throw the floor open now to others who would like to share some of their thoughts from the breakout groups, or also from sharing some of their experience about that need for engaging beyond sort of traditional sort of value chains. So would anybody else either put your hand up or unmute yourself? I'd ask my colleagues, Charlie and Matthew, to also keep an eye out, because I can't maybe see everybody there. Would anybody like to share any of the key points that came up in your breakout group? Charlie, I could ask you maybe, you've kept your eye on the chat. Any good points that have come up there you'd like to share with us?
I haven't really had time to read it, to be honest. I mean, the thing that stuck with me from our group was around sort of framing the opportunities for government engagement in ways that are also around business opportunity. I mean, I think a big focus of the VBV work has really been around how do we manage systemic risks, and I think that's like the sort of the big existential question that we're really trying to address. But the reality is that the more you can also frame it around current business, more pertinent current risk and opportunity, then the more investment and engagement you're going to get from companies. So is there a happy middle ground between the sort of the policy conversations, which companies can often perceive to be rather lengthy and sometimes turgid, and sort of they engage with initially, but then it's kind of too long and too slow, versus the space which is maybe more framed around collaborative innovation, which is, you know, perhaps a little bit more fast moving, more creative, and can we bring some of these collaborative innovation approaches more into the policy environment, so that there's a sort of happy middle ground in between. And I know from sort of an anecdotal story from our work here with pineapple in Costa Rica, was that as the policy process went on over a number of years, companies increasingly dropped away. But when there was a specific opportunity around, you know, a business opportunity around creating other revenue streams from waste coming out of the pineapple production process, suddenly all the companies showed up again, because you know, it was much more motivating for them. So that's the kind of thought that's with me at the moment.
Thank you, Charlie.
Christine?
Yeah, thank you. I would just add that the other entity would be the financial. And so, for example, you know, if a private sector would come in and they want to maybe work with more women farmers, you know, what are the policy constraints around those women farmers, whether it's land tenure, whether it's, you know, having access to their own finances, microfinancing. And so how do you bring in also the financial groups to work with government and private sector to maybe move policy in more of a favorable direction to target specific cohorts? And that's not for every country, but that's in a lot of countries where there's a gap there.
Thank you for sharing that. There's some great points in the chat. We're not going to have a chance to get to them all, but Pancha Pramudia, I'm sorry if I've not pronounced that correctly. I'm quite interested in your point about bridging private sector and small scale producers. I think in our group as well, we talked about the missing middle, but it's also, you know, maybe sometimes we don't look at the range of private sector actors that can be brought into these wider multi-stakeholder processes, be they really small producers or national private sector. So I know that's something that we work with as well. So working beyond the narrow scope of organizations that you're directly involved in your supply chain, to be more aware of that wider group is, I think, really very important. I would just like to give you a minute. Anybody else like to jump in and share a thought that they have, or reflection from the breakout group before I hand over to Matthew for wrapping us up?
I'd like to jump in with one thought, and really applicable, I think, to the food, bev, and agriculture sector, is we see, you know, a substantial amount of the impacts happening on farm. And so that's where a lot of the action is needed. And so just really ensuring that the financial incentives reach those on-farm actors through the supply chain, right? If the demand's coming from the consumer, it doesn't necessarily convert into a financial incentive that trickles all the way up the supply chain to the on-farm actors. And so wanting to highlight that as an opportunity, but also a challenge for supply chains.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And how do we sort of bring in not only the producers in our supply and value chains, but kind of the wider community representation into some of those multi-stakeholder forums that we're trying that we're working with. So thank you very much, everybody, for those inputs. Again, lots of rich content in the chat there, which we will be capturing. But I'll hand over now to Matthew to wrap us up. Thank you.
Thanks, Christina. And thanks everybody for participating today, and to all the presenters. And we wanted to share a question that around, I'll take away one lesson learned from this webinar. If you could share, I think Federica's going to paste it in the chat, but please share one thing that you would do differently in your project or work based on what you've learned today. So if you want to type that in the chat box, feel free. In terms of next steps, we will be sharing the slide deck and materials from the VVB guidance via email. The recording, I believe, will also be available. And yeah, so we can send that out to the participants. And as Charlie mentioned during the presentation, the slide deck is meant to be adapted to your own needs and kind of used accordingly as you see it has value in your work. So please feel free to do that, and we're happy to provide support and guidance on that where necessary. I'd also put another plug in for the FACS community, formerly Green Commodity Community, now FACS. You can visit at what I don't know if we can put up the URL. There we go. Still Green Commodities Community URL, but it is now the FACS Food and Agricultural Commodity Systems Community. Please visit regularly to look at for new events that we have upcoming. So that's all from my side. I don't know if Charlie or anybody else has any closing remarks, but thanks again, everybody, for participating, and we'll be in touch.
Thanks, Matthew. Yeah, just amused by Roger's point about making it simplistic. I could have said at the beginning when I was originally asked, at the beginning of this project, one of our colleagues from Mondelez, what would be a good output from the project? He said 3 PowerPoint slides, because you know, the more concise, the better. So I think on that criteria, we definitely failed by producing 80. But we do encourage you to, you know, pick the 3 that are going to be most useful to you. And we particularly were keen on the use of visual images in order to try and make it as simple as possible and to kind of leave people with a clear visual picture that can really help shift mindsets. So that is the intention. So we'd be delighted if you do pick up any of these images and start using them. I mean, I think particularly the one with the kind of farms nestled in landscapes, nestled in sort of jurisdictions, nestled in the global. It's so obvious, and yet people don't really think about it. I was delighted to see that Paul Hartman from the Jeff had picked that up a while back and was using it. So if there are particular images in there, I encourage you to use them, because I actually think this is really how we influence mindsets. Thank you all, and look forward to further collaboration.